Hello there, and welcome. Whether you've just settled in for the night, or you're listening on a peaceful afternoon, I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, we're going to step into a world that so many people think they understand, but few really do. You've heard the stories, you've seen the armor, the katana, the battle cries in movies, but the real life of a samurai in feudal Japan, that was something else entirely. Often far more quiet, more painful, more disciplined, and at times more deeply human than anything in the legends. In this slow drifting story, we'll walk gently through the life of a samurai, not just the warrior, but the man beneath the armor. We'll explore what it truly meant to live by the code of bushidō. What a day in the life was like, what they ate, what they feared, what they loved, how they died, and maybe how they dreamed. But before we begin, I'd love to ask you something. Where are you watching from? And maybe even more curiously, what time is it? Where you are? It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel, and to imagine a samurai's life echoing quietly into your own space tonight. Now, take a deep breath, settle in, maybe dim the lights, or light a candle. Let's begin. It's dawn in the countryside of feudal Japan. The mist still lingers over the rice paddies, curling gently around wooden homes and winding dirt roads. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a bamboo water spout clacks hollowly, tipping forward and splashing, then resetting with a wooden knock. It's quiet, but not still. Nature hums, even softly. In a modest home on the edge of a lord's estate, a man sits cross-legged on a tatami mat. He is dressed simply, no armor, no helmet, no sword by his side just yet. His eyes are closed, his hands rest palm down on his knees. He breathes in slowly, deeply. You might not guess it at first glance, but this is a samurai. Not in the way pop culture has taught us. No battle today, no duels, no storming fortress gates. But this too is samurai life. The word samurai comes from the Japanese verb sabara, meaning to serve, not to conquer, not to command, but to serve. And that's the quiet truth that echoes underneath the entire samurai tradition. They were warriors, yes, trained to kill, but they were first and foremost men of service, to their lords, to their clans, to their ancestors, to their country, and eventually to an ideal greater than themselves. And what that ideal became was bushidō. Bushidō, the way of the warrior, is often romanticized as a strict code, filled with honor, death before dishonor, and stoic swordplay. But in reality, it was more like a weaving of old threads: loyalty, simplicity, discipline, patience, humility. It changed over time, and it wasn't written in a single scroll, but it lived in moments like this one, a samurai at sunrise, breathing deeply, still before the day begins. He rises, slowly, and walks barefoot to a small shrine in the corner of the room. There, he kneels again and bows. The shrine honors his ancestors, wooden tablets, incense, a few offerings, a reminder that everything he does today must reflect on everyone who came before. He doesn't speak, not out loud. This moment is for respect, not display. You can already begin to feel it, can't you? The life of a samurai was less about action and more about intention. When he finishes his morning prayer, he dresses, a clean underkimono, a patterned outer robe. His hakama, pleated trousers, are tied securely. Only then does he retrieve his swords, one long, one short, the katana and the wakizashi. Together they are known as the daisho, the soul of the samurai. But still he does not strap them on with the dramatic flair of a movie scene. No dramatic unsheathing, no slow-motion slice, just calm, practiced movement. These weapons are tools, sacred, yes, but tools. There is a rhythm to his mourning. Every gesture is deliberate, no movement wasted. You begin to understand something. Being a samurai wasn't about living fast and dying dramatically. It was about control of the body, the mind, and the moment. Outside, the day brightens. Insects begin their chorus. A servant brings tea. The samurai thanks her with a small bow of the head. The tea is poured, steaming, bitter, and calming. There is no rush to drink it. He may be called upon to teach today, or to deliver a message, perhaps to inspect the rice fields, or mediate a dispute between villagers. Only rarely does it mean taking up arms. because in times of peace, the samurai were often administrators, poets, educators, philosophers. They practiced calligraphy and studied Confucian texts. They wrote death poems in anticipation of battles that sometimes never came. And yet, even on quiet days, they were never far from violence. Every moment, even a sip of tea, had to be done with the awareness that life could change instantly, that death might arrive in silence, without warning. You begin to see how that shaped the way they lived. They learned to walk with intention, to speak softly, to bow correctly, to choose words carefully, to wield their swords not out of emotion, but out of calm. This calm was cultivated over decades, from boyhood. Imagine this samurai as a child, 6 years old, perhaps, already learning to sit still, to respect silence, to follow his father's movements. He would rise before the sun, sweep the temple, practice writing kanji with a brush, drill with wooden swords. There were no weekends, no summer breaks. Life was training, in body and in spirit. And by the age of 13 or 14, he would be formally recognized as a warrior, a man. He would receive his first real blades, sometimes a gift from his father or his lord. He would bow deeply, take an oath, and from that day on, he would walk the path of bushidō, the way of the warrior. But the path was not glamorous. He would be expected to endure discomfort without complaint, to kneel for hours in meditation, to eat simply, sleep lightly, and always be ready to serve. If his lord demanded his life, he was expected to offer it. If he brought shame to his name, he was expected to end it. This was the shadow that followed him always. Seppuku, ritual suicide, a brutal, deliberate act, meant to cleanse dishonor. It was not just a punishment, it was considered a privilege, an opportunity to die with dignity. Let that settle in for a moment. Imagine living every day with the knowledge that failure could mean slicing open your own belly with a short blade, kneeling on the floor, surrounded by silent witnesses, your second in command standing by to cut off your head if you hesitated. That is not the fantasy version of the samurai. That is the reality. That is the truth beneath the armor. And yet there was beauty in this world too. Samurai gardens were often quiet marvels. Small raked stones, perfectly placed rocks, koi fish moving through cool water. Simplicity was revered. In the tea ceremony, for example, even the placement of a cup, or the folding of a cloth, became a kind of art. These were not contradictions, but balances. Strength and stillness, discipline and softness, death and beauty. They carried these contradictions like their swords, not to show off, but to keep them close, ready. Even the samurai's armor reflected this duality. Yes, it was protective, iron plates lacquered and laced with silk cords, but it was also elegant, designed with care, with family crests, painted details, carefully chosen colors. There was meaning in every piece. The helmet, or kabuto, was often dramatic, with horns or crests to intimidate. But inside, the face beneath it was often calm, eyes narrowed, breath even. Because fear was not an option. Even in battle, fear had no place. Imagine stepping onto the field of battle with enemies lined across the valley, the air thick with tension. There were no chaotic Hollywood melees, no mindless swinging. Instead, samurai often announced themselves before the fight, calling out their name, their ancestry, the deeds of their father and grandfather. It was a kind of performance, yes, but also a way to give honor to the fight, to say, I see you, you see me. We meet here, not as monsters, but as men. Some duels lasted only seconds, a single strike, a bow, a death, because for all their beauty, their poetry, their elegance, samurai were trained killers. They learned the art of the quick draw, iejutsu. They trained to strike before the enemy even had time to raise a weapon. They studied the joints, the arteries, the angles. The body was a map, and the sword was the compass. And yet they also wrote poems, soft, delicate ones, often about nature, fleeting life, a falling cherry blossom. Because they knew, better than anyone, how fragile life was. As the sun climbs higher in the sky, our samurai finishes his tea. He sets the cup down carefully. He rises without a sound. The floor doesn't creak. His swords are placed at his side, and he steps into the day. We'll follow him now. Not into battle, not yet, but into the life that most people never see. The quiet hours, the slow decisions, the patient waiting, the weight of expectation. Because to be a samurai was not about the kill, it was about the code, and the code never sleeps. Let's drift backward in time now, before the calm swordsman, before the poised tea drinker, before the loyal retainer standing beside his lord, there was a boy. And not just any boy, a boy born into the right house, at the right moment, in the right family. Because to become a samurai, you could not simply decide. You had to be born into it. The path was marked for you by your ancestors. The armor was waiting long before you ever learned how to hold a sword. It begins in the household of a minor noble, perhaps in a regional estate, far from the capital. The year is 1583. The wars between powerful clans still shape the country's destiny. The great unification of Japan is underway, but peace is not yet secure. The boy is small but not too small, sharp-eyed, a little serious, old enough to sense the expectations placed upon him, though he doesn't yet understand them. His name carries weight, not just because of who he is, but because of who his father and grandfather were. And so, at the age of 5 or 6, he begins to learn what will shape his entire life. At first it's not the sword, it's not the bow, it's the bowing, the posture, the words, the way you enter a room, the way you speak to a superior, the way you hold still when being watched. These seem like small things, but they aren't. They are the foundation of reiji, or proper conduct. He learns to sit in setsu, kneeling, with the tops of his feet flat on the mat, back straight, hands resting quietly. At first it's painful, his legs go numb, his knees ache, but he doesn't complain. Complaining is not the way. He's taught to pour tea correctly, to greet elders, to clean the family shrine every morning before the sun rises. He learns not to ask questions unless invited. He watches, he imitates. Slowly the shape of a samurai begins to form, not through action, but through attention. By age 7, he's reading classical texts, Chinese philosophy, Confucius, Laozi, lessons about loyalty, humility, wisdom. These ideas are not explained directly, they are absorbed, folded gently into his understanding of the world. Then comes the sword, but not the real one, not yet. Instead he's given a bokken, a wooden practice sword, shaped like the real thing, but blunted and smooth. It is not a toy, it is not to be swung wildly, it is to be respected. And with it he begins his martial training. Every morning, before the house wakes, he practices the basic forms: 1 cut, 2, 3, stop, reset. Again and again, his teacher corrects his stance, his grip, his balance, his breathing. It's not glamorous, it's not exciting, but it's the beginning of something. Over time, he adds new disciplines. He learns the bow, kinjutsu, not just how to shoot, but how to prepare, how to tie the cord, how to stand, how to release the arrow in silence. The samurai bow is large, tall, and used from horseback. It requires strength and calm. Then the spear, sojutsu. The polearm was a favored battlefield weapon, and mastering it meant mastering reach, timing, and coordination. No wasted movement, no second chances. He learns jujutsu, grappling in close combat, how to unbalance an enemy, how to move with the body, not against it. Not brute strength, but precision. He practices until sweat soaks his robes, and the sun is high, and then he studies. In the afternoon, he sits with a brush and ink. He writes poems, copies texts. He learns calligraphy, not just as a skill, but as a way to discipline the hand and mind together. And if he misbehaves, if he disrespects his elders, or forgets his duties, he is not scolded in anger, but he is corrected, firmly. Perhaps his food is withheld. Perhaps he is sent to meditate alone. Discipline is always close, but always quiet. By the age of 12 or 13, he is nearly grown, not fully, but enough. His father begins to speak to him differently, less like a child, more like a man. He is taken to observe local meetings, disputes among villagers. He sees how power is exercised, not through shouting, but through presence, through silence. He begins to understand the weight of leadership. And then, the ceremony comes, the genpok. It is a rite of passage, the transition from boyhood to adulthood. usually around 14 or 15, depending on the clan. On that day he receives his first real swords, not the full-length katana yet, but the shorter blade and the name that will follow him for life. He dresses in formal robes. He bows before his father, his lord, his family. He takes an oath to serve, to protect, to uphold the honor of his name. It is a proud day, but it is also the beginning of a lifetime of pressure, because now he is expected to carry the burden of his ancestors, to maintain the family name, to be strong, and wise, and composed, even when it is difficult, especially when it is difficult. He begins real duties, patrols, escorting officials, delivering messages, serving in minor battles, if they arise. He trains with full blades now. He moves with other men, older, more experienced. He listens, watches. He learns that courage does not always look like bravery. Sometimes it's walking into a negotiation knowing you may not return. Sometimes it's holding your tongue when insulted by someone of higher rank. Sometimes it's standing your ground when your lord makes a mistake, and taking the blame for it, silently. This is what he was raised for. But it's not always glorious. There are long days, rainy seasons, cold winters, boring assignments, days spent inspecting grain stores or listening to merchant complaints. There is no cheering crowd, no clashing swords, just duty, and always, the sword. It stays at his side, always. When he sleeps, it's near. When he eats, it's laid carefully across his lap. When he walks, it's adjusted with every movement to avoid offense or danger. He sharpens it himself, cleans it, wraps it. It is an extension of his spirit. He never draws it without cause, but he is always ready. That readiness, that quiet confidence, is not something you can fake. It comes from years of stillness, repetition, observation, endurance. He has faced pain, hunger, exhaustion, confusion, and still, he walks the path. Now as he reaches adulthood, he begins to shape his own identity. Perhaps he begins to write his own poetry. Perhaps he chooses a personal crest, or modifies the family symbol in some subtle way. Perhaps he dreams of becoming a teacher, or a strategist, or a trusted retainer to a powerful lord. Or perhaps, he simply wants to serve well, and die with honor. Whatever his goal, he knows this much. There is no room for selfishness, no time for arrogance. The path is long, and steep, and often lonely. But it is the path he was born to walk, and he walks it without complaint, because that too is the way of the samurai. So now, our young samurai has begun to take his place in the world. He wears the sword. He rides with his peers. He bows correctly, speaks carefully, and moves through the estate with measured steps. He is a man now, in name, in duty, in expectation. But there is something deeper that begins to form now. Not something you can touch, not something anyone points to directly. It's like breath, or shadow, ever present, but rarely named aloud. It is bushidō. You've heard the word perhaps. It's often translated as the way of the warrior. But that phrase is a little too clean, too modern. In reality, bushidō was less of a code, and more of a current. A slow moral stream running under the surface of samurai life. It wasn't a single scroll handed down from master to student. It wasn't carved in stone, or recited aloud each morning. Rather it was something lived, understood, absorbed over years of quiet discipline. Let's take a slow breath together, and explore what it meant. At its core, bushidō was about honor. But not in the shallow sense. Not just about looking good in front of others. Honor to the samurai was internal. It was the mirror you looked into when no one else was watching. To live with honor meant you were honest, loyal, just, brave, yes, but also gentle when needed. Wise enough to know when to act, and when not to. There were 7 principles often associated with bushidō, though interpretations varied. Each was like a piece of thread, woven into the larger cloth of a samurai's spirit. The first was gi, rectitude, or righteousness. The ability to do what is right, no matter the cost, even if it means death. Even if no one ever knows you did it. Then came yu, courage. But not reckless, fire-blind courage. It was about doing what must be done even when fear is present. Not without fear, but through it. Jin, benevolence or compassion. A samurai was trained to kill, but also to care, to protect, to serve those beneath him, not abuse them. Rei respect, not just politeness, but deep sincere reverence for others, even enemies. A warrior who cannot respect life, cannot be trusted to take it. Makoto, honesty and sincerity. A samurai's word was binding, a promise made was a promise kept, even if the world turned upside down. Meiyo, honor. Again, not the performative kind, but the kind that sits deep in your bones, the kind that makes you kneel when you've done wrong, even if no one saw it happen. And Chudo, loyalty. Total devotion to one's lord, to one's family, to one's role in the great pattern of things. These ideals weren't shouted from rooftops. They were quietly passed from father to son, from teacher to student, from one bow to the next. A samurai did not always succeed in living them out, but he tried, and when he failed, he owned that failure. Because failure for a samurai wasn't something to hide, it was something to redeem. This is where the practice of seppuku comes into the picture again. You'll remember, ritual suicide, performed when a samurai lost his honor and wished to restore it. It wasn't about escaping shame, it was about confronting it, head on, and with dignity. It was brutal, yes, but in that moment, the samurai reaffirmed his code. He said, I failed, and I will own it, fully, with the last act of my life. Not every samurai took this path. Many lived quiet, honorable lives without ever facing that final test. But the fact that it existed, that it was always possible, shaped the way they lived. It made their words matter. It made silence sacred. It made the sword more than just a weapon. You see, to a samurai, the sword was a soul, not a soul-like object. A soul itself. The katana was forged with layers of folded steel, heated and hammered again and again, until the blade was not only sharp, but balanced, flexible, true. The forging process itself was a kind of prayer. Some swordsmiths were monks, others worked in silence, treating their work as holy. A well-made blade was not merely admired, it was revered. When a samurai received his sword, he received a piece of himself. It would be his companion until death. But Bushido taught him not to swing it lightly. A fight was not sport, a death was not entertainment. Every cut, every draw, every defensive block was to be made with precision, not rage. Anger was a weakness, it clouded judgment. A real warrior struck only when it was absolutely necessary, and never to show off. This wasn't just about discipline, it was also about balance. Bushido taught the samurai that life was not a ladder to be climbed, or a battle to be won. It was a garden, to be tended. Each moment had its place. Each person had their role. You did not chase more than what was yours. You bowed to the patterns of the world, and found peace within them. In this way, Bushido blended warrior values with Zen Buddhism, and Confucian thought. From Zen, the samurai took stillness, emptiness, the idea that nothing lasts, and that peace is found not in possession, but in release. From Confucianism, they took duty, structure, harmony within the household, and within the social order. The result was a life that was strict, yes, but not cold. Samurai found beauty in simplicity, in a single falling cherry blossom, in the slow swirl of tea in a cup, in the silence between words. This, too, was Bushido. It shaped how they walked, how they fought, how they loved, how they died, and perhaps most importantly, how they waited. Because so much of samurai life was not war, it was waiting. Days, weeks, months of peace, boredom, anticipation, the stillness before the storm. Bushido taught them to fill that stillness with grace, to train, to write, to refine the self. Because the enemy was not always across the field, sometimes the enemy was within. Pride, fear, jealousy, laziness, a wandering mind. And so they trained as much for inner strength as for outer skill. They practiced meditation, sword forms, poetry. They copied ancient texts by candlelight and swept temple paths in the early mist. These things may seem small, but they weren't. They were the fabric of the samurai. In the modern world we often chase action, results, movement. But for the samurai, stillness was strength, restraint was power. To do nothing, but do it with full awareness, that was mastery. And that mastery wasn't just for the battlefield,
It was for the home, the village, the lord's court. Bushido taught the samurai to serve with humility, to lead without arrogance, to correct others without cruelty. Imagine a man who could end your life in one breath, bowing low to a peasant out of respect. That was the ideal. Of course, not every samurai lived up to it. Some were cruel, corrupt, lazy. The code was a light. Not everyone chose to walk in it. But those who did, left behind a legacy that still glows, centuries later. As we leave this part of the story behind, imagine again that quiet man in his early 30s, sitting at the edge of his estate, the sun setting behind distant mountains, his sword resting beside him, a scroll open on his lap. He's not thinking about glory or conquest. He's thinking about balance, about how to live in such a way that his name, when spoken after his death, will cause others to bow their heads, not in fear, but in quiet respect. That was Bushido.
The morning begins, as always, with silence. A low mist blankets the wooden roof of the residence, and the faint, rhythmic rustle of bamboo in the wind provides the only sound. Inside, the samurai is already awake, not because someone has called for him, but because the sun has begun to rise, and no man of discipline should sleep past its first light. This is the rhythm of his life. There is no alarm, no schedule posted on the wall. There is only the quiet insistence of ritual, a structure so deeply embedded in his day that it no longer needs to be remembered. It simply is. His first act is to kneel before the household shrine, a slow bow, a whisper of incense, a nod to ancestors long gone, and to the day ahead, whatever it may bring. Then, without words, he prepares for his training. Contrary to the flashy swordplay we often associate with samurai, much of their physical practice was deeply repetitive. Hours spent on the same cut, the same stance, the same controlled breath. The goal was not novelty, it was mastery. A typical morning might begin with kata, choreographed forms, performed alone or with a partner. These were not fights, but sequences, predefined movements meant to embody the principles of combat: distance, timing, posture, control. The sword was not yet real. For daily practice, the samurai used a bokken, that wooden blade from childhood, now a lifelong companion, heavy, unforgiving, and safer than steel, but not without its dangers. A wrong move, even in training, could break bone or spirit. He moves through the forms slowly, at first. One step, one cut, again. Adjust the angle, again. Breathe in, step forward, again. The repetition is the point. Because in battle, you do not have time to think. The body must act on memory, not the memory of the brain, but of the muscles, the tendons, the bones. Muscle memory is forged like steel, through pressure, and heat, and time. And so he trains. After sword work, he might switch to the longbow, the yumi. Unlike Western bows, the Japanese bow is asymmetrical, taller than the archer himself, with the grip placed lower than the center. This design allowed it to be fired from horseback, or while kneeling behind cover. Archery practice is not just about hitting a target, it is about ritual. Every movement is prescribed: how to take the bow, how to nock the arrow, how to breathe, how to stand. Before every release he bows to the target. This bow is not for the wood, or the straw, it is for the act itself, a gesture of respect, of intention, of humility, before the moment. Because the shot must be calm, focused, still, a mind clouded by ego or haste will miss, even if the arrow hits the mark. If the spirit was wrong, the act was wrong. The samurai knows this. As the morning fades into afternoon, his training shifts to other weapons, perhaps the naginata, a polearm favored not only by samurai men, but by women as well, or the yari, a spear used in battlefield formations, or even jujutsu, the grappling art, designed for those moments when sword or spear fail. Each weapon brings a new lesson, a new weakness to overcome, but always, the core remains the same: control. By midday his robe is soaked, his shoulders ache, his legs burn, but his breathing remains steady. He takes his midday meal in silence. The food is simple: steamed rice, miso soup, a small portion of grilled fish, pickled vegetables. No extravagance, no waste. Even the act of eating is disciplined. No slouching, no loud chewing. He holds the bowl close to his face, the chopsticks light in his hand. A servant pours tea. He nods in thanks, but says nothing. He eats not to indulge, but to sustain. And after the meal, he does not rest. He writes, perhaps a letter to a distant cousin, or a reflection on a passage from an ancient text, or a poem, short, quiet, composed in the waka or haiku form. These poems are not shared widely. They are not posted or praised. They are a mirror for the samurai to see his own mind. A moment captured, the sound of rain on tile, the shape of a falling leaf, the echo of a bird call before dawn. Through poetry, the samurai practices observation, the act of seeing without reaching, feeling without grasping. Later, he may meet with other retainers. Perhaps they discuss estate matters, grain collection, irrigation, disputes between farmers. The samurai is not above such tasks. He is, after all, a servant of his lord, and the land must be kept in order. He listens more than he speaks. When he does speak, he does so plainly, with purpose. A single word, chosen well, often says more than 100 poorly thrown. This is not only politeness, it is power, because the samurai's true strength is not in how loud he is, or how many men he commands. It is in how carefully he moves. After the meeting, he might walk the grounds, check the guards, visit the stables. He may stop at a temple, not to pray, necessarily, but to sit, to observe the stone path, the wind moving through the trees, the pattern of water as it flows over rocks. Even in times of peace, the samurai is never far from death, and so he does not waste life. Every moment, even the quiet ones, are treated as sacred. As the sun begins to set, he returns home. He washes, carefully. Water is poured from a wooden ladle over his hands, then his face. He removes his outer robes, hangs them with care. He sits with his family, if he has one. Children are not treated as burdens or distractions. They are, like all things, to be shaped with patience. He speaks to them not in command, but in example. Perhaps he reads to them, or shows them a new brush technique, or simply listens as they speak of their own small battles, a knot they could not tie, a phrase they mispronounced, a fall they took in the garden. He nods, smiles, if the moment allows, and when night falls, he kneels once more at the shrine. Another bow, another whisper, another promise, to serve well tomorrow. Then he sleeps. The sword remains close, but untouched. It is not a restless sleep. It is the sleep of one who has met the day with presence, not perfectly, but sincerely. And that is enough. The samurai was never truly his own man. Yes, he trained alone, meditated alone, died alone, if it came to that. But his life was not his, to shape freely. He was bound, as tightly as his sash, to a web of obligations, to his family, his ancestors, his code, and above all to his lord. This was not servitude in the way we often imagine it today. There was no paycheck, no contract you could break. The bond between a samurai and his lord, his daimon, was sacred. It was personal, emotional, even spiritual. It was known as gyuri, a duty that surpassed logic or convenience. If your lord fell, you fell. If he rose, you rose with him, quietly, loyally. And if he asked for your life, it was given. The structure of feudal Japan was built on layers, each one resting on loyalty. At the top sat the emperor, divine in name, but by the medieval period, often more symbolic than sovereign. Real power shifted to the shogun, a military ruler whose authority was backed by force and strategic alliances. Beneath the shogun stood the daimon, powerful lords who ruled provinces and commanded armies. And under them, the samurai. They were warriors, yes, but also administrators, judges, messengers, enforcers of peace, and sometimes, agents of war. Their loyalty was vertical, not to the land, or the people, but to the man above them. This made their world fragile. If your lord succeeded, you thrived. If he was defeated, you might lose everything, land, title, honor, and there was no shame in that. If you met the loss with dignity, still, it shaped how a samurai walked through the world. He didn't boast, he didn't scheme, he didn't try to step out of place. He served, and that service took many forms. Some samurai spent their lives in the countryside, defending castles, leading patrols, maintaining order. Others lived closer to the court, where their swords stayed sheathed but their words carried weight. They might be asked to negotiate land disputes, settle feuds between farmers, or oversee harvests. They might be sent to a distant province with a letter, a gift, or a warning. These missions were never taken lightly. Even a simple message could be a matter of life or death, because honor was not only individual, it was collective. When a samurai rode out, he carried not just his name, but his lord's. His actions reflected the household. His failure brought shame, not only on himself, but on everyone above and around him. And so, every detail mattered. The way he dressed, the way he spoke, the way he bowed. There were no small mistakes. A loose strap on his armor, an overly familiar tone in his greeting, a hesitation at the wrong moment. These could cost him respect, favor, or worse. And yet, this pressure did not always feel heavy. To many samurai, it felt grounding, because in a world so often chaotic, this structure gave meaning, purpose, direction. He knew where he stood, he knew what was expected, and in that knowing, he found peace. But loyalty did not mean blind obedience. A true samurai was expected to advise his lord, to offer correction if needed, respectfully, yes, but truthfully. To flatter was weakness, to deceive was shameful. Better to speak hard truths than soft lies. Sometimes, this led to tension. There are stories, many of them, of samurai who displeased their lords by being too honest, who were dismissed, or punished, or asked to take their own lives. And they did, not with bitterness, but with grace. Because for them, the ultimate loyalty was not to a person, but to the ideal of service. They did not fear death, as long as their name remained clean. But what about those samurai who had no lord, not by choice, but by circumstance? These were the ronin. The word means wave man, a poetic way of saying adrift. A samurai, without a master, without a post, without a place. Some ronin were former retainers, cast out after their lord's fall. Others were born into the status, their families never regaining service. Their lives were hard. In a society so focused on order and rank, being a ronin was a kind of exile. You had no salary, no title, no backing. You might wander from province to province, seeking employment, offering your sword to whoever would pay. Some became mercenaries, bodyguards, teachers of swordsmanship. Others faded into poverty, their armor rusting in the corner, their honor slowly worn away by time and hunger. But not all. Some ronin remained fiercely committed to the samurai code, even without a lord. The most famous story of all, the 47 Ronin, tells of such men. Their master was wrongfully forced to commit seppuku, and so, they waited, planned, and then when the moment came, they avenged him. They knew the price, and after the deed was done, they turned themselves in. They were sentenced to death, and they accepted it, not as punishment, but as fulfillment. Their act, and their end, was seen as the highest expression of loyalty. Even today, their graves are visited with reverence, because a samurai's worth was never measured by survival. It was measured by character. That character was not built overnight. It was shaped by the people around him, his teacher, his comrades, his family, and above all, by the rituals that filled his days. Because for the samurai, ritual was more than routine. It was rhythm, harmony, a way to align the self with the world. Every act had its form. The way he cleaned his blade, the way he folded his clothes, the way he served tea to a guest. These were not burdens, they were offerings. To move with intention, in even the smallest things, that was a kind of prayer. One of the most elegant expressions of this was the tea ceremony. You might imagine a samurai, rough, armored, grim, bowing over a cup of tea, in a quiet room, with nothing but the sound of steam and breath between sips. And you would be right. The tea ceremony, or chanoi, was not just a social event, it was a meditative act, a moment of equality. Inside the tea-urn, there was no rank, no sword, just presence. The host would spend hours, sometimes days, preparing for a single ceremony, choosing the right bowl, the right scroll, the right flower for the season, and the guest, usually another samurai, or a trusted friend, would enter with humility. There would be silence, then slow conversation, then tea.
Every movement had meaning. The turning of the bowl, the folding of the cloth, the placement of the ladle. It was all deliberate, not stiff, not robotic, but mindful. A reminder that beauty was not in decoration, but in simplicity. And in that simplicity, the samurai found a kind of peace that the battlefield could not offer. Because even the most seasoned warrior, the one who had fought and bled and served, needed stillness. He needed a place to lay down the sword, even if only for a moment. He needed to remember that he was not just a weapon. He was a man of silence, of presence, of care. And it was in these quiet rituals, far from the clash of blades, that the true strength of the samurai was often revealed. The seasons changed slowly in feudal Japan, and with them so did the colors of a samurai's world. Spring came with plum blossoms, and the return of clear skies. Trees dusted with pink, temples warmed by sunlight, and villagers humming with the sounds of planting and song. Summer brought the hum of insects and the weight of heat. Cicadas screamed from the trees, armor stuck to skin, fields thickened with rice. Autumn arrived like a whisper, cool winds, the smell of smoke, maple leaves, turning red like falling embers. And winter was silence, frost on the rooftops, breath made visible, swords that rang colder in the air. A samurai did not merely live through these seasons, he moved with them. Each one brought new duties, new rhythms, new lessons. He would spend spring preparing, sharpening tools, tending to his household, inspecting his retainers. In summer, he might oversee construction or travel. Autumn was often the season of inspections, taxes, and preparation for the hard months ahead. And winter was for introspection, long hours by dim light, copying texts, writing poems, sitting still, listening to the wind. But the seasons were not just poetic changes, they affected everything: strategy, logistics, clothing, even state affairs. No army marched in spring floods, no siege held through winter snow. Even in warfare, nature had the final say. And when war came, it did not always come with warning. For all the daily stillness of a samurai's life, he lived in a world balanced on uncertainty. The peace could fracture at any time. A lord might die, a rival might rebel, a border might erupt with bandit raids. And when it did, the sword was not a symbol anymore. It was survival. A call would come, a message on horseback, a horn in the night. Armor that had hung, polished and idle, was suddenly pulled from the rack. Dust was swept off, straps checked, steel cleaned. There was no rushing, no panic, just motion, deliberate, practiced. Every piece of gear had a place, every retainer a role. The samurai might not sleep that night. He might write a letter to his wife, or kneel at the family shrine, or simply sit in the dark, eyes closed, hands resting lightly on his knees, not in fear, but in readiness. Because when a samurai went to war, he expected not to return, not out of pessimism, but out of principle. A good death was always an option, not a goal, but a path. At dawn they rode, and what awaited on the other side of the mountain could be anything: a skirmish, a full assault, a siege, a standoff. But war, in feudal Japan, was rarely the chaos we imagine. It began with formality. Banners were displayed, ranks were shown, messengers sent, challenges issued. Sometimes there was posturing before the fighting began, a display of strength, numbers, discipline. Archers loosed the first volley, and then, steel met steel. The samurai, despite the ideals of calm and code, could be fearsome in battle. They shouted as they charged, not mindless screams, but cries of identity, name, clan, lineage, a declaration. I am here, I am ready, I am not afraid. They fought with discipline, but also desperation, because behind every technique was real consequence. One misstep, and the blade could end you. And so they fought, not wildly, but with the fire of those who know what honor demands. Spears shattered, bows emptied, steel clanged against steel, men fell. Some battles lasted hours, some days, a few stretched into weeks. Sieges, especially. And in a siege, time moved differently. Food ran short, illness crept in. The walls became the edge between life and death. The samurai would walk those walls, speaking softly to the soldiers, inspecting defenses, planning every possible outcome. He was not always the loudest voice, but when he spoke, others listened. Because in war, calm was a kind of leadership. And then, when the fight was over, there was no celebration, only silence. A battlefield after combat is a still place. Crows, smoke, the dead. The samurai did not boast. He buried his comrades. He offered prayers for the enemy. He cleaned his blade, slowly, carefully. Blood must never be allowed to stay. And then he returned, sometimes with fewer men than he had left with, sometimes injured, sometimes to a lord who was pleased, sometimes not. And if the war had gone badly, there might be blame, or punishment, or shame. A samurai had to bear it, because even in failure, dignity was his duty. There is a word, koryu. It refers to a Buddhist memorial ritual for the dead. Sometimes samurai would perform these rites themselves, even for those they had killed, not to erase the act, but to acknowledge the weight of it. They did not see death as clean, but as meaningful. A warrior who could end life must be able to honor it. Otherwise, he was not a warrior. He was a butcher, and that would be unthinkable. Not all battles were fought with blades. Some were quieter, slower, invisible to the eye, but just as deadly to the soul. Among the samurai, there was a kind of war that unfolded in the heart. It was the battle between duty and desire, between loyalty and doubt, between the man and the mask. Because behind the armor, the rituals, the discipline, the samurai was still human, and even the most composed could feel the ache of uncertainty. Imagine a samurai, one who had served faithfully for years. He has a wife, perhaps a child, a small estate. He has performed his duties with care. He has followed the code, and yet, there is a whisper of fatigue. The sword is heavier now than it was in youth, the face in the mirror more lined. The peace he helped secure feels fragile, the politics around him more complex. He begins to wonder, quietly, if all this sacrifice has made a difference. He does not say these things aloud, but they show in the slowness of his walk, in the way he lingers longer at the shrine, in the soft pause before he answers a question. This is not weakness, it is reflection. A samurai was trained not only to fight, but to think, to read, to contemplate. Many were well versed in Chinese classics, Buddhist texts, and the teachings of Confucius. They studied not to debate, but to align themselves with a deeper sense of purpose. Still, that purpose could be elusive, especially in times of change. By the later centuries of the samurai era, the nature of warfare had shifted. Gunpowder had arrived. Battles were no longer fought with honor and ceremony. They became brutal, impersonal, loud. The sword, once the soul of the warrior, was no longer supreme. And for some, this was a quiet tragedy. Not because they mourned the past, but because they felt themselves drifting. Adrift in a world that no longer needed them as it once had. In peacetime, a samurai could serve as a bureaucrat, a judge, a teacher, a poet. But he was not always at peace with that. He carried generations of warrior tradition in his bones, and sometimes, it had nowhere to go, so he turned inward. Some wrote essays on duty, others took up ink painting, or calligraphy. A few retreated into religious life, shaving their heads, donning robes, living simply. These transitions were not failures, they were part of the path, because the essence of bushidō, the way of the warrior, was not confined to the battlefield. It was a lifelong practice, a way of being, a daily negotiation between action and stillness, pride and humility, life, and the ever-present possibility of death. Even in retirement, a samurai was expected to embody this spirit, to be an example for younger retainers, to advise without pride, to live with grace. He might sit for hours, teaching a child how to hold a brush. He might listen to disputes between neighbors. He might plant trees. He would never live to see bloom. All of this was service. All of it, samurai work. There were no small acts, because how you live when no one is watching. That was the true measure of character. Even the strongest hands grow old. Even the sharpest blades dull. And even the proudest samurai must one day confront the truth that no armor can protect against time. He may feel it first in the morning, when he kneels and his knees do not forgive as they once did. When the call to training feels heavier than it used to. when the clarity of his youth turns into the stillness of age. But for a samurai, aging is not defeat, it is transition. Just as cherry blossoms fall with beauty, so too must a warrior let go of the spring of his life, without clinging to it. Age is not shameful, it is instructive. And in feudal Japan, an aging samurai held a place of quiet honor, as an elder, a teacher, and a bearer of wisdom carved by experience, not imagination. In his final years, the samurai becomes something else, not less than a warrior, but more. He carries memory like a sword, not to brandish, but to guide. He does not boast of his battles. He reflects on them with humility. Not all were glorious. Some left regrets. Some taught harsh lessons. But even regret has value, if remembered with grace. In the quiet of a summer dusk, he may walk the temple garden, alone, not in mourning for what is past, but in gratitude for having walked that path. The stones underfoot, the wind in the bamboo, the echo of children training in the courtyard. These things tell him the world is still turning, and he is still part of it. One day his lord may summon him, not for combat, but for counsel. And the samurai will come, dressed not in armor, but in soft robes. His hands perhaps shaking now, his steps slower, but his voice firm. Because words like blades, can be sharp, and silence, like strategy, can win battles. When younger retainers gather, he watches. He sees in them the same fire he once carried, the same pride, the same fear, though they may not show it. And when they ask him for advice, not all do, he does not lecture, he tells stories. Because stories are how truths are passed from one heart to another, without injury. They are how warriors become ancestors. And when he feels that his days are drawing to a close, he prepares. There is no panic, no denial. Death is a familiar guest, not welcomed, but not feared. He may write his final poem, his jade, a death poem, composed in the last season of life, meant to capture the essence of his departure in a few simple lines. Perhaps it goes, no blade at my side, yet the wind cuts just as deep. Autumn dusk descends. He may also prepare his affairs, land possessions, swords passed on, his favorite writing brush, the scroll he read each morning. He ensures his armor is polished one last time, not for war, but for remembrance. And then in peace, he waits. For some samurai, the end comes in bed, surrounded by family, by apprentices, by those who still bow deeply when they enter the room. For others, it comes alone, on the road, in a garden, watching the moon rise. But the setting does not matter. What matters is how he meets it, with open eyes, with a calm heart, with nothing left unsaid. Some samurai, under certain circumstances, chose to end their lives by their own hand, in seppuku, ritual suicide, not from despair, but from duty. Perhaps they had failed in their service, perhaps their lord had fallen, perhaps they were asked to do so as an act of political balance. To us, this might seem incomprehensible, but to the samurai, it was one final act of will, to choose the moment of death, to face it unflinching, to leave the world with dignity intact. The act was precise, prepared, witnessed. There was even a second, the kai shakunin, a trusted comrade, who would end the suffering swiftly after the cut was made. It was not done lightly, and not without grief, but even this, the darkest of rituals, was approached with clarity, because the samurai believed that life was not measured in years, but in presence, and death, like life, should be met with form. But not all ended this way. Most simply faded, their names remembered on stone tablets, their poems kept in family scrolls, their swords hung in places of honor. And though the world moved on, as it always does, their spirit lingered, in the way a student bowed before training, in the silence held after tea was served, in the stories whispered to children on rainy nights. The samurai, even in death, remained part of the living world, because the legacy of a life lived with honor does not vanish. It echoes, and each time a blade is drawn with care, each time a word is chosen with intention, each time someone holds duty above desire, that echo is heard. It is easy, from the outside, to romanticize the samurai, to see only the poetry, the elegance, the drama of their world. But their true greatness was not in myth. It was in the daily acts, the early rising, the careful step, The hard choice made quietly, the apology given with bowed head, the letter written at midnight, the pause before drawing the sword. These things, small, steady, sincere, are what made a samurai. And in the end, it is those same things that allow us to understand them, not as distant figures in honor, but as human beings, flawed, disciplined, lonely, loyal, always walking the narrow path between violence and virtue, chaos and calm, and always choosing as best they could, the way of honor.
As the sun sets behind distant mountains and the evening breeze stirs the leaves of ancient pines, the life of a samurai reveals layers far beyond the battlefield. What remains etched into history are stories of valor and honor, yet the true essence of a samurai was woven through quieter moments, the everyday choices and inner struggles. We have seen the armor, the sword, the fierce battles, the code of bushidō, and the acceptance of mortality. But beneath all of these, there was the human reality, the samurai's relationships, his solitude, his dreams, and his fears. Consider the samurai's family life. Often the public image shows a lone warrior, but the truth is more complex. Many samurai had wives and children, and they bore the weight of their roles not only as warriors, but as heads of households. The responsibilities extended beyond the battlefield into governance, economic management, and ensuring the welfare of their people. This required patience, diplomacy, and sometimes harsh decisions. The wife of a samurai was no mere bystander. In many cases, she managed the estate while her husband was away at war or on official duties. She was expected to uphold the household's honor, educate the children, and even train in self-defense. This was not a life of luxury, but of constant vigilance and duty. The children, especially the sons, were raised from a young age with discipline and instruction in martial arts, literature, and ethics. Education was crucial. A samurai without knowledge was incomplete. The cultivation of mind and body was equally vital. This blending of the martial and the intellectual was a defining feature of samurai culture. But what of the loneliness? For many samurai, the life they led was isolating. The demands of service, the constant awareness of death, and the strict adherence to social codes often left little room for personal expression or freedom. Friendships were tempered by caution and hierarchy, and emotional openness was rare. Still, they found moments of quiet connection in tea ceremonies, poetry gatherings, or shared meals with trusted comrades. These instances, though fleeting, offered respite and reminded them of their humanity. Another often overlooked aspect is the spiritual life of the samurai. The influence of Zen Buddhism shaped much of their outlook. Zen's emphasis on mindfulness, simplicity, and acceptance resonated deeply with the warrior's need to face death without fear. Meditation was a tool to cultivate calmness and focus, essential for both combat and life. The samurai also practiced rituals to prepare themselves for death daily. This was not morbid, but practical, a way to live fully and without regret. They understood that life's impermanence demanded presence in every moment. In literature and art, this has been captured beautifully. Haiku poems, minimalist ink paintings, and no theater explored themes of transience, duty, and beauty. The samurai were both patrons and creators, engaging in cultural pursuits that balanced their martial identity. Yet the samurai class was not static. Over centuries, social and political shifts transformed their role. The Edo period brought relative peace, but also bureaucratization. The sword became more symbolic than practical. Samurai grappled with these changes. Some adapted, becoming scholars, administrators, or artists, while others longed for the glory days of war. This tension between tradition and change is a thread that runs through their history. It is a story of resilience, adaptation, and sometimes, quiet despair. As we near the end of this journey into the samurai's world, consider the legacy they left behind. Their code, their discipline, and their cultural contributions continue to influence not just Japan, but the global imagination. But beyond legend and myth, the samurai remind us that honor is a practice, a daily choice made in the small acts of kindness, courage, and integrity. They teach us about facing life's uncertainties with grace, embracing the fleeting nature of existence, and finding balance amid chaos. And so, the story of the samurai is not just about swords or battles, it is about the enduring human spirit striving to live meaningfully, even when the path is narrow and the future unknown. As the last light fades from the sky, and the gentle rustle of bamboo whispers a soft farewell to the day, we arrive at the close of our journey through the world of the samurai. It has been a winding path, one filled with the clang of swords and the stillness of meditation, the weight of duty, and the softness of poetry. The samurai, those iconic warriors of feudal Japan, are often seen through a lens of legend, fearless fighters, noble heroes, masters of deadly arts. Yet the reality was far more nuanced. Their lives were shaped by contrasts, strength and vulnerability, honor and pragmatism, fierce loyalty and personal sacrifice. We have walked with them through the training grounds where young boys learned to wield the katana, through the silent moments of prayer before battle, and into the quiet chambers where the elders penned their thoughts on life and death. We have glimpsed their struggles with changing times, their grappling with identity when the swords grew cold and peace prevailed. The samurai's journey was, at its core, a meditation on impermanence. The cherry blossom, fragile, beautiful, fleeting, was their emblem of life itself. They knew that everything they valued could vanish in an instant, whether by the hand of an enemy, the stroke of fate, or the slow march of time. And so they chose to live with full awareness, honoring each breath as if it were their last. This embrace of mortality did not make them reckless. On the contrary, it gave them clarity and focus. To face death without fear was to live unburdened by doubt. It was to act with purpose and humility. Their code, bushidō, was not a rigid set of rules but a living philosophy. It guided them through hardship and triumph, teaching courage, benevolence, respect, honesty, and above all, loyalty. Yet even this code was imperfect. It demanded much, sometimes too much, from those who followed it. The samurai were human, after all, prone to error and sorrow. Their stories include moments of failure and grief alongside glory, but it is in this very complexity that their true humanity shines. The samurai remind us that life is not about perfection, but about striving, about meeting each challenge with integrity, even when the outcome is uncertain. In modern times, their legacy continues to captivate. From films and literature to martial arts and philosophy, the samurai inspire people worldwide. Yet beyond the spectacle, they offer us a timeless lesson that honor is found in how we live each day, how we treat others, and how we face our own shadows. So as you watch this video, perhaps from somewhere far away, and in a time different from this story's setting, take a moment to reflect on your own path. What does honor mean to you? How do you meet your fears? What stories will you leave behind? The samurai did not live for fame or fortune. They lived for meaning, and in that simple truth lies their greatest gift. Thank you for joining me on this slow journey into the world of the samurai, wherever you are, and whatever time it may be. I hope this tale has offered you calm, insight, and a quiet moment to breathe. Until next time, take care.